Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dorothy Day, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, an intimate portrait of my grandmother, by Kaye Hennessy, narrated by Randye Kaye. Preface. In the last years of her life, my grandmother often woke up hearing in her mind the words from her beloved Dostoevsky, "The world will be saved by beauty." Of all the words she wrote, of all the quotes she loved to repeat, of all the advice and comfort she gave to countless people, in all 5 of her books and 50 years of her column, and in a lifetime of diary and letter writing, this is what has come to give me the most hope. For if, after years of struggle, weariness, and a sense of deep and abiding failure, she believed in salvation through beauty, then how can we not listen? I discovered this aspect of my grandmother while reading her diaries. They were published 2 weeks after my mother's death, but it took almost a year before I could bring myself to open the book. Then, once opened, I couldn't put it down. It was as if I, dying of thirst, were given a long, cold drink from the purest of wells, and as I read, I felt a growing need to add another layer to this tale, not only to portray the grandmother I knew and her daughter, her only child, Tamar, but also to somehow bring my grandmother and mother together in ways they hadn't been able to achieve while they lived. On the morning after I finished reading, I lingered in that half-asleep state where both dreams and reality take on a different quality altogether, that in-between state where you sometimes hear a voice you are certain is from someone in the room calling your name, and you wake up saying, "Yes, what is it?" but no one is there. My dream was brief, as dreams of this kind are, no beginning or end, just a flash containing all I needed to know. And in that moment I felt sure and true the knowledge of both Tamar's and Dorothy's lives, with all their experiences and memories, and I was overcome by this knowing. I felt the weight and the miracle of their lives, and I wondered if I were strong enough, wise enough to tell this story. But haven't I been working on it all my life, living in their wake and stumbling along trying to make my own way? And isn't this my history also? One of the elements of what makes a person extraordinary, I have come to believe, is when their inner and outer lives are in accord, when what they do in the world is what their innermost being leads them to do. This is why the history of the Catholic worker is the history of my mother, the history of the relationship between my mother and grandmother, and the history of my family. The winter following my grandmother's death was bone-shivering, teeth-achingly cold, the temperature hovering between 20 and 30 degrees below zero night after night. At the time, my mother lived with her small black dog in a hand-built cabin on the edge of the woods. She was alone and grieving, and yet she turned to me. She was 54 and I was 20, and in an effort to help us both through this dark time, she and I began a discussion about her mother. These talks were not often easy to follow. Their paths could be just as elusive as Tamar was herself. She was unfocused and uncollected. She jumped from thought to thought, while I tried to follow her hints and allusions or the sentences she couldn't bring herself to finish, telling me her story in the grab-bag way she had, an image, a thought, a sparkle and flash of laughter, a retort of anger, regret, or loss. We continued our conversations on the first anniversary of Dorothy's death while staying at the Catholic Workers' Beach Cottage on Staten Island, New York, and then in a house in the small Vermont town of Springfield, where my mother moved from her cabin, the neighborhood rough but full of poor, working-class families, just as Tamar liked it. Again and again we returned to this discussion until the last weeks of her life 27 years later. Many writers, scholars, historians, and theologians have chosen to tell the story of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker, the movement she began in the 1930s, grounded in performing the works of mercy, and that still exists today, decades after her death. But it seems to me that those who knew her best are often the ones most fearful of trying to write about her in all her complexity, richness, and contradictions. Tamar greeted each new book or film about her mother with fatalism, yet she couldn't stay away and she couldn't keep from being disappointed. Then, when such a person as Dorothy Day is your grandmother, an examination of her life isn't an intellectual, academic, or religious exercise. For me, it is nothing less than a quest to find out who I am through her and through Tamar. It is a quest to save my own life, though I don't yet know what this means. Seamus Heaney once said that in his poetry he wrote about those moments he sensed held greater meaning within, even though he might not ever find out what the meaning was. And I see this quest as not only for me or for my family, but for anyone who senses that greater meaning and desires to explore it. There was a group of children who grew up at the Worker in the 60s and 70s who called Dorothy Granny, as my siblings and I do, though they were not related to her, and this is as it should be. We all need to live our lives as if we are Dorothy's children and grandchildren, being comforted and discomforted by her, as she invites us to be so much more than how we ordinarily see ourselves, and perhaps more important, how we see each other. Dorothy said there was never a time when she wasn't writing a book or thinking of writing a book, whereas Tamar wasn't a writer and had difficulty expressing herself in any medium. Dorothy was a talker, and my husband was too, she said. That was enough. But there did come a time when she felt the desire to write. When her father, Forster Batterham, died 4 years after Dorothy, Tamar discovered in his apartment letters Dorothy had written to him in the 1920s and early 30s. In them, Tamar finally could read of the love and longing her mother felt for this silent man, so much like his daughter. In them, Tamar could once again see her mother, the Dorothy Day she so loved, and who seems in danger of being lost to the world, a woman of great joy and passion, humor and love of beauty. Tamar grieved the loss of this vibrant woman to the annals of hagiography and the desire to see her as a saint, and at times to Dorothy's own nature, especially during her severe and pious stage, as Tamar called it. In these letters, Tamar found what she had longed for, love between her mother and father, Dorothy the saint and Forster the scientist, the two halves of her heart. And after reading these letters, she wanted to show the world this part of the story, her story. I can see the two of them in my mind's eye, mother and daughter, facing each other, loving each other, challenging each other. This is the story of my life, says one. No, this is the story, says the other. Many of Dorothy's favorite quotes had to do with love. Love is the measure by which we shall be judged, and where there is no love, put love, and you will find love. Those two are from St. John of the Cross. Then there is Dostoevsky. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. But it is one of Dorothy's own quotes that I love the best. God understands us when we try to love. Tamar liked to say, all the world needs is loving kindness. Her love was of a more practical nature, the words of a mother of 9 and a steward of the land, whereas Dorothy's love had an element of mystery, a quality she needed for the life she led. Dorothy also said we all feel alone and we always will. She said that we struggle against both freedom and responsibility, and with these two we always will. Tamar said we all must live our own disasters. Agony and foolishness, she called these lives we lead. For me, these quotes of theirs reveal something of the love they gave and received, the lessons they learned, and the heroism it required, each in her own way. I don't think they ever said these words to each other, for if they had, maybe then they would have been able to understand the nature of their struggle with each other, and maybe their intense love for one another would have been leavened by this understanding. But Tamar was unable to write her story, as Dorothy was unable to write her last book, in which, it seems, she wanted to make sense of this relationship between mother and daughter. And so here I am, left holding the pen, still grieving the loss of my mother, still grieving for the two of them, and led by the only thing that matters, the only thing worth writing about, love. Part 1. The Mystery of Grace. Chapter 1. There is no time with God, my granny said, and so I set out to find Tamar and her parents when they were still together. And where do I find them but on the beach? The beach where Tamar was conceived in a cottage not 20 feet from the water, where she learned to walk in the sand, to say the rosary while following the edge of the lapping waves as the tide ebbed and flowed, and to pray to the dead spider crab hanging on the wall beside her bed. It is Staten Island, 1927, and Tamar is 1.5 years old. I want to know what happened to bring these two people, Forster and Dorothy, together, and what drove them apart. I want to know why Tamar would always feel this father loss, missing him even when she was too young to know what that meant. The three of them are in a rowboat, and Dorothy and Forster are silent. The happiness they had felt with each other and with the birth of Tamar is giving way to something that seems insurmountable, that seems tied to Dorothy's constant thirst for a mystery she has yet to name. How did they get there? How far back do I need to go? To those days long before Tamar's birth? Let me begin again. My granny said there is no time with God, and so I set out to find her when she was a young woman of 20, the age I was when she died. The year is 1918, and it's a bitter January morning in the pre-dawn hours. While deep snowdrifts cover the streets of New York City, Dorothy's fresh, new life is giving birth to struggle, pain, and questioning. Although she doesn't yet know it, it is a time when she will turn from one path and head along another, unsure of what she is doing and where she is going. Until now, her youth and energy, her exploration and freedom have propelled her along a life of great excitement. At this moment, the hour both late and early, she is sitting in a rough, gaily decorated Greenwich Village tea room called Romany Marie's, and she is holding a dying man in her arms. But wait, I must go back even further in this peeling away of the layers of the past. Ah, yes, there she is, tall and thin, more bones than flesh, with a strong, clear jaw and large, oddly slanting blue eyes, thin and straight brown hair with auburn highlights, and hands and feet that are long, narrow, and graceful. It is the summer of 1916, and she is 18 and roaming the horse manure-spattered cobblestone streets, not so far from where the Catholic worker is now, with a nervous stride as if there were never enough time, and full of an unquenchable curiosity about people and their work, families, and traditions. Burdened by heat and loneliness, she is looking for work as a journalist, scared, full of hesitation, but determined to make her own way, following her father's footsteps. Her two older brothers, Donald and Sam, had Pop's blessing to become journalists, even though he had kicked them out of the house as soon as they had jobs. But she did not. Dorothy and her father were two peas in a pod in some ways, and each as bullheaded as the other. It wasn't that John Day was against the idea of his daughter being a writer. He had started her on that path when she was a child and had helped publish her first piece for the children's page of the Chicago Tribune, followed by book reviews for the Inter-Ocean, the Chicago newspaper where he worked. Their parting of ways may have begun when Dorothy, at the age of 16, won a $300 scholarship for the University of Illinois, sponsored by the Hearst papers, by placing 15th in 20 winners of a contest in Latin and Greek. John Day wasn't interested in higher education. He hadn't finished high school, and neither did his two older sons. In his view, journalists didn't need an education. They needed to start work as soon as they were able, preferably at 15. But Dorothy, regardless of her love for Cicero and Virgil, turned out to be an indifferent student and careless with money. When her scholarship, which should have been sufficient to see her through her degree, ran out, she got a job cooking for a family at 20 cents an hour, then gave that up and almost starved to death. After 2 years, penniless and bored with her studies, Dorothy left with her family for New York City, where her parents had first met, married, and had the 4 oldest of the 5 day children. Enamored by the socialism she had picked up reading Jack London and Upton Sinclair, and while walking through the Polish and Italian working-class neighborhoods of Chicago, pushing her baby brother in a carriage, Dorothy found work with the New York Call, a paper of socialists, industrial workers of the world, IWW members, trade unionists, and anarchists. When she got the job, faced with her father's belief that it was a woman's role to stay home and be beautiful, as Tamar described it, she left her family's place in Brooklyn and, with not much more than her phonograph, moved into a room on Cherry Street in Manhattan. The flat was between the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges and upriver from the Call's office on Pearl Street, near the South Street Seaport. While walking under the Brooklyn Bridge on her way to and from work, she began to know the men on the streets who, as the winter months approached, warmed themselves by fires lit in barrels. For $5 a month, Dorothy had a tiny hall bedroom in a 5-story tenement with a window onto the air shaft and a toilet off the stairwell for the use of 2 families. As with all the tenements in the Lower East Side, there was no electricity or central heating. To keep warm, people burned coal in the fireplaces, if they could afford it, driftwood if they couldn't, or turned on their gas ovens. The doors, halls, and stairs were made of wood, and fires were as common as bedbugs. There was also no hot water, and Dorothy used the public baths along with the Jewish women. The halls were dark and foul-smelling, but the room was clean, and the family she rented the room from provided her with a thick down comforter. They were Orthodox Jews, and when she came home after midnight from the paper, she would often find a plate of food by her bed, with a note from one of the children, the parents spoke only Yiddish, explaining that they couldn't serve milk or butter if there was meat. Dorothy would come to claim that it was the experience of living in rooms rented out by working-class families and the long walks through the Lower East Side that would begin her affinity with the hard-up and struggling. This was how her enduring curiosity about people, about their lives and their work began. Could she ever be part of that hard life? Could she even do it, she wondered. The Days had never been well off, although they often lived as if they were. When Dorothy was born, Pop was working as a clerk. When he left Brooklyn for San Francisco in search of newspaper work, Dorothy's mother, Grace, took in boarders in their Bath Beach house until she and the 4 children could join him. After losing everything in the 1906 earthquake, including the furniture they had shipped from New York around Cape Horn, they moved to Chicago following another one of Pop's newspaper jobs. When that newspaper failed, Pop wrote a novel sitting at his typewriter day after day in the living room while the children were forbidden to make any noise, until he was able to find work with the Inter-Ocean. When they returned to New York in 1916, he worked as the racing editor for the Morning Telegraph. The family lived week to week, though Pop sometimes had winnings from the racetrack. He was a gambling man, my great-grandfather, a Southerner from a family of Tennessee farmers, though his father was a beloved and respected doctor, described by one of Dorothy's cousins as kind, considerate, careless about his bills, and generous to all, poor or wealthy, black or white. Grace was from a family of whalers from upstate New York, a Northerner and a bitter pill for Pop's mother, who took a dislike to Dorothy because she looked like Grace, the Yankee, and preferred Della, Dorothy's sister, because her looks took after Pop. Grace came from poverty herself and had worked in a shirt factory from the age of 12 to 14 to support her mother and 3 sisters after her father, Napoleon Bonaparte Satterlee, died of tuberculosis. He had been a chairmaker and veteran of the Civil War, during which he was wounded in the throat and thereafter couldn't speak above a whisper, and a survivor of Libby Prison, the second deadliest prison of the Confederacy. Grace would come to bear 5 children to a man whose earnings came and went on the racetrack, who didn't know how to share his wife with his children, and who never showed them any physical affection, though he ensured they all grew up well-read. He and Dorothy were much alike, strong-minded and stubborn. my way or the highway, as Tamar described it, and they fought. When Pop saw that Dorothy was determined to make her living as a journalist, he sent word to his cronies in the newspaper business to discourage her. Lore has it that he booted her out of the house when she found work at the Call, but then he had booted his sons out too. John Day liked his horses, he liked his drink, he liked his women, and he looked good at all times. He was tall, imposing, and well-dressed. The Days always were beautifully dressed, no matter how broke they were, and Grace, often despairing during the day, would dress up to have dinner with her children. "Get clothed and in my right mind," she'd say. Like her mother, Dorothy dressed like a well-bred young woman even as she moved from one cold Lower East Side room to another, writing articles for a pittance, and she would maintain that sense of style long after she started the Catholic Worker, still longing for lovely clothes. "Every woman needs one good dress," she often said, looking pointedly at Tamar. Within a few months of working at the Call, Dorothy's salary of $5 a week was raised to $10. She wrote a flurry of articles over a period of 5 months, working from noon to midnight covering child labor, strikes, fires, starvation and evictions in the slums, food riots, and anti-war meetings. She interviewed Margaret Sanger one day and Mrs. Astor's butler another. She and a young man, a radical writer by the name of Itzhak Granich, who would come to love her, interviewed Leon Trotsky, one of the architects of the Russian Revolution. She was in Madison Square Garden in March 1917, when it filled with workers celebrating the fall of the Russian Tsar, and 2 days later when it held a pro-war rally. At night, she attended socialist, anarchist, and IWW balls at Webster Hall on East 11th Street, while by day she picketed garment factories and restaurants, her first experiences of facing public indignation and hostility while being bored with the endless walking back and forth. And she also started to smoke cigarettes. In the winter of 1916 and 1917, the Call moved from Pearl Street to St. Mark's Place, and Dorothy's walks were lengthened. She began to wander the streets and hike the Palisades in New Jersey with Itzhak, and she became his girl. They sat and talked into the early morning hours on the piers over the East River, where every now and then Itzhak, or Irwin as he was now signing his work, would break into Yiddish folk songs or Hebrew hymns. Irwin was a good-looking man with thick, black, and unruly hair he couldn't be bothered to cut, so he was always pushing it away. Like Dorothy, he was generous with money. He loved to explain Marx and what needed to be done to change the world, and rarely spoke about himself or his own writings. He came from an Orthodox Jewish family, theater-loving Romanian immigrants who lived on Christie Street in the Lower East Side. At the age of 12, Irwin got a job working in a gas mantle factory in the Bowery. At 13, he began working for a delivery company and fell in love with horses. He said if he hadn't become a journalist, he would have become a teamster. He had attended New York University and Harvard, but like Dorothy, didn't finish. University wasn't nearly as exciting as the education that could be found on the streets. Immigrants were arriving with an appetite for learning and attending night school, theater, and lectures by poets, professors, and philosophers who often spoke from soapboxes, Herbert Spencer on the corner of Delancey Street, or Marx in the lecture halls. Atheism, anarchism, socialism, vegetarianism, women's rights, free love, free speech, free thought. It was all in the air. The socialists were mainly immigrants and old trade unionists who sat drinking tea in East Side cafes, often speaking Yiddish. The IWWs were American, though the heyday of the great strikes was over by 1917, and the leaders were all in jail. The anarchists were a small group. Dorothy didn't pay much attention to them, and the liberals were those who worked on the Masses, a collectively owned monthly begun in 1912, full of art, cartoons, and political commentary. In the Village, poetry, plays, and art, the lyrical left, as some called it, flourished along with the radical thinkers, and Irwin was involved with all of these groups. He had joined the IWW and experimented with anarchist communes. By 1914, the Masses was publishing his articles, and in 1916, he had become a member of the Socialist Party. The Provincetown Playhouse, which was housed in the stable of an old townhouse on McDougal Street that the journalist John Reed had found, in its first New York City season, performed his play Ivan's Homecoming under what they called the War Bill, and it was through this that he introduced Dorothy to the village. Before the influx of the Bohemians, Greenwich Village had been a neighborhood of Italian, Irish, and German immigrants, with a small segment of African Americans who helped construct the bridges, the subways, and the first of the skyscrapers. Then, around 1910, a different sort of immigrants started to arrive, first from Europe and then from within the States. Some were fleeing failed marriages or family lives, drawn by something brave and new that just might be their salvation. They were also drawn by an awareness that the world was changing, and the heartbeat of this change was to be found surrounding Washington Square Park. The north side of the park was lined with old, sedate houses and tall trees in small gardens, while on the south side, these bohemians gathered on narrow and crooked streets, in run-down red brick tenement houses so miserable, people preferred to congregate in the parks, bars, and tea rooms. After rehearsals and shows, the Provincetown players met next door at Polly Holliday's restaurant, the first of the village bohemian restaurants, where for 50 cents you could get a leg of lamb or roast beef and gravy, though one look at the cockroach-infested kitchen could kill your appetite. Through the Provincetown players, Irwin introduced Dorothy to two people who would come to influence her in unexpected ways. The first was Peggy Baird Johns, a small, delicate woman 7 years her senior, with peculiar yellow eyes, who spoke with a Long Island accent and was rumored to be the first woman in the village to bob her hair. Peggy, it seems, knew the entire village literary and radical crowd, including Jack London, John Reed, Emma Goldman, and Nan Ray, and was married to the poet Oric Johns, one of the first of the free verse poets. As an artist, she studied at the Art Students League under Robert Henry. She painted landscapes and portraits, and wrote poetry and had a few assignments for the Call. She believed, for a time, in free love. Neither Dorothy nor Peggy had any real reason to be around the Provincetown Playhouse. Peggy seemed content to paint, and Dorothy occasionally read parts for absent actors during rehearsals, and once auditioned for a part but was so miserable she never did it again. She was succeeding in earning her living as a journalist, however meager her wages were, but her writing dissatisfied her. She did not take to the Call's editorial pressure to distort the truth and make things look worse than they were in order to, as she saw it, promote socialism. Dorothy disagreed with Irwin in how she saw the world. His Lower East Side and hers were not alike, though Dorothy allowed that he knew it better, having grown up on Christie Street. Irwin emphasized the misery and degradation of the slums, while Dorothy, though she saw the misery, also saw the dignity and courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. In spite of these differences, she and Irwin became engaged, and he brought her home to meet his stern and beautiful Orthodox Jewish mother, who looked at Dorothy sorrowfully. As all three of her sons were dating Gentile girls at the time, she didn't speak, but she offered food. After Dorothy left, she broke the dish Dorothy had eaten from. Dorothy quit the Call right before the Selective Service Act was passed in May 1917. All the young men argued about what to do while Dorothy worked briefly for the Collegiate Anti-Militarism League at Columbia University before bumping into Floyd Dell, the managing editor of The Masses, and becoming his assistant. She loved her work at The Masses. The publication took itself less seriously than the Call, and it published ideas Dorothy had never seen, depictions of Christ as a longshoreman or as a fisherman sympathetic to unions. What a glowing word it was to us then, she wrote of her time at the paper almost 30 years later. to speak to the masses, to write to the masses, to be a part of the masses. Her own first contribution was a poem followed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?